Picture this. You're standing on the edge of a dark European forest sometime around 500 AD. No borders, no flags, no nations, just trees, mud, rivers, and fear. The Roman world is collapsing behind you. Legions are gone. Roads are cracking. Cities are empty shells. Everywhere, people are moving, fleeing, disappearing. Now here's the part nobody warns you about. If you blink just once and open your eyes a century later, half of Europe has changed its identity. Not conquered, not replaced, rewritten. From the Baltic Sea to the Balkans, from the Elbe River to the Volga, a single cultural name suddenly dominates the map: the Slavs. And here's the problem: no one saw them coming. Before we go any further, pause for 1 second. Most people watching this video aren't subscribed, and that's fine. But this channel, Helix Origins, exists to uncover histories that were buried, softened, or deliberately distorted. If you want stories that don't fit into textbooks, stories written in bloodlines and DNA rather than political slogans, subscribe now. Because what you're about to hear isn't comfortable history, it's the kind that makes people angry. Now back to the mystery. The Slavs don't enter history the way every other major European people does. They don't leave a long trail of pottery styles. They don't leave epic poems written centuries earlier. They don't leave clear ancestral graves stretching back thousands of years. They just appear. Roman historians were obsessive record keepers. They cataloged Germanic tribes like collectors. They mapped Celtic rituals. They wrote pages and pages about Scythians, Sarmatians, Goths, Vandals, Huns. And yet, for the people who would become the largest linguistic group in Europe, classical sources barely mention them. 4 times. That's it. 4 vague references. The first clear appearance comes in the early 6th century when Byzantine writers mentioned strange raiders called Sclaveni and Antes. No deep origin story, no ancestral homeland, just sudden violence at the empire's borders. And then something impossible happens. Within 1 century, the Goths vanish from Eastern Europe. The Scythians disappear from the steppe. Ancient Balkan peoples lose their names. Entire identities collapse, and in their place, the Slavs stand everywhere. Here's why historians quietly panic when they look at this period. Linguistics shows that early Slavic languages were nearly identical across massive distances: Poland, Ukraine, the Balkans, Russia. That should not be possible. Languages fragment fast when population spread. Latin shattered into dozens of tongues. Germanic dialects diverged quickly. Celtic languages splintered over short distances. But Slavic, at the exact moment Slavs explode across half of Europe, they're still speaking almost the same language. That doesn't look like slow migration. It doesn't look like ancient roots. It looks like something spreading rapidly, almost like an idea. And that's where the story becomes dangerous. For over 100 years, historians fought over 2 explanations. One camp claimed the Slavs had always been there, invisible until history noticed them. The other argued for a small tribal group expanding outward from swampy homelands near modern Ukraine. Both theories had holes. Both relied on guesswork. Both avoided one uncomfortable question: if Slavs were placed everyone, where did everyone else's blood go? That question couldn't be answered until the 21st century. Until bones started speaking, until genetics entered the conversation. When genetic sequencing finally became precise enough to test ancient skeletons, historians expected confirmation of the old story: a massive Slavic population surge replacing Germanic, Scythian, and Balkan peoples. Instead, they uncovered something far more disturbing, something that didn't just challenge Slavic history, but collapsed the entire idea of ethnic replacement in early Europe. Because the DNA didn't show disappearance, it showed continuity. And once you see what that means, you'll never look at Slavic identity the same way again. This wasn't a story of conquest, it was a story of transformation. And what happened next was the greatest identity shift Europe has ever experienced. When geneticists first turned their attention to Slavic origins, they expected clarity, a marker, a signature, something unmistakably Slavic. What they found looked promising at first. Across Eastern Europe, Poland, Ukraine, Russia, one Y chromosome haplogroup appeared again and again at staggering levels: R1a. In some regions, over half of all men carried it. For a moment, historians celebrated. Here it was, the Slavic genetic fingerprint, the proof of a massive population expansion sweeping across Europe. Case closed. Except it wasn't, because when researchers zoomed out, the celebration turned into confusion. R1A wasn't uniquely Slavic. It appeared in northern India, in Iran, across Central Asia, in Scandinavia. It followed the ancient roots of Indo-European migrations, thousands of years older than any Slavic identity. R1A wasn't a name, it was a continent-spanning echo. Finding it in a Slav was like finding wheat in a field and claiming you'd discovered farming. Yes, it was present, but it told you nothing about who was responsible. For a while, the investigation stalled. Then, genetics did what history couldn't. It learned to read finer details. Instead of looking at broad haplogroups, scientists began isolating subclades, tiny genetic branches that split at specific times and places. This was the breakthrough. Two branches changed everything. R1A/Z280 and R1A/M458. Unlike their ancient parent, these subclades were recent, sharp, localized. Z280 dominated among Eastern Slavs, Russians, Ukrainians, Belarus. M458 clustered tightly among Western Slavs, Poles, Czechs, Slovaks. And here's the key detail. These subclades emerged 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, deep inside Central and Eastern Europe. Not in Asia, not on the steppe, not during the medieval expansion, long before anyone called themselves Slavic. This seemed to solve the mystery. A stable population carrying these markers remained in place for millennia. Then, around the 6th century, they expanded outward, spreading their genes and language. That explanation fit beautifully, too beautifully, because when archaeologists started testing ancient skeletons before the Slavic expansion, the numbers stopped making sense. Let's start with Poland. Before 500 AD, Poland is one of the clearest cases in European archaeology. Germanic tribes dominated the region. Goths, Vandals, Burgundians. Their pottery, their burial customs, their settlements, everything screamed Germanic. History says they left during the migration period, heading west and south, leaving empty lands behind. Perfect conditions for Slavic settlers, but ancient DNA doesn't care about stories. When scientists compared pre-500 AD Polish skeletons to medieval Slavic remains from the same regions, they expected a genetic break. They didn't get one. Yes, medieval remains carried the Slavic DNA, Y chromosome marker M458, but their overall genetic profile, autosomal DNA inherited from all ancestors, matched the earlier Germanic population almost perfectly. The math was brutal. If mass replacement had occurred, this continuity would be impossible.
The conclusion was unavoidable. The people didn't leave. They stayed. They simply stopped being Germanic, and Poland wasn't an exception. It was the pattern. Across Central Europe, the same contradiction appeared again and again. Slavic paternal markers layered on top of older genetic foundations. Germanic, Celtic, Baltic DNA surviving almost intact beneath a new cultural identity. This wasn't migration, it was conversion. But the most unsettling discovery came from the steppe. The lands north of the Black Sea were once ruled by the Scythians, legendary horse warriors feared by Persians and admired by Greeks. They weren't obscure, they were famous. Herodotus wrote about them. Persian kings fought them. Their gold still dazzles museums. And then, according to traditional history, they vanished, replaced by Slavic farmers. But when scientists tested Scythian remains, they found DNA strikingly similar to the Yamnaya, the original Indo-European steppe populations. Then they compared that DNA to modern Ukrainians and southern Russians. The overlap was undeniable. The Scythians didn't disappear. They became Slavs, not metaphorically, biologically. Their language died, their warrior culture collapsed, their identity dissolved, but their bloodlines flowed straight into Slavic populations. This wasn't conquest. It wasn't genocide. It was total cultural replacement without genetic erasure. And once researchers recognized that pattern, they couldn't unsee it, because the same thing had happened somewhere even more explosive: the Balkans. The Balkans are where the old story finally collapses, because if the Slavic expansion was truly a massive demographic invasion, this is where the evidence should be overwhelming. This region had dense populations, established cities, Roman administration, and well-documented peoples: Illyrians, Thracians, Dacians, Greeks. Romanized provincials. History claims that when Slavic-speaking groups entered the Balkans in the 6th and 7th centuries, they overwhelmed these populations and became the ancestors of modern South Slavs, Serbs, Croats, Bulgarians, Bosnians. But genetics tells a very different story. When scientists analyzed paternal lineages across the Balkans, they expected to see R1a dominance. They didn't. Instead, one haplogroup towered above all others, I2a. This lineage isn't Slavic, it isn't Indo-European, it isn't even Bronze Age. It belongs to Europe's first hunter-gatherers, people who entered the continent more than 10,000 years ago, long before farming, long before Indo-European languages, long before Rome. These were the ancient Balkan natives, and in many South Slavic populations, I2a doesn't appear as a minority, it dominates. In some regions, it represents the majority of male ancestry. That means something explosive. Huge numbers of people who today speak Slavic languages and identify as Slavs are not descended from Slavic migrants at all on their paternal line. They are direct biological descendants of pre-Roman, pre-Greek, pre-Slavic Balkan peoples. The Slavs didn't replace them, they absorbed them. And once you accept that, the rest of Eastern Europe falls into place. In the Czech lands, ancient Celtic markers persist beneath Slavic identity. In Belarus, Baltic ancestry forms the foundation of the population. In northern Russia, Finno-Ugric genetics dominate under Slavic language and culture. In southern Russia and Ukraine, steppe nomads, Scythians and Sarmatians live on in Slavic form. Everywhere the same structure appears: old blood, new language, new name, which forces a terrifying realization. The Slavic expansion wasn't a wave of people, it was a wave of identity, a cultural system so effective that entire populations adopted it voluntarily, generation after generation, until their former names vanished from memory. So what made Slavic culture so powerful? Why did it succeed where Romanization failed, where Germanic kingdoms fractured, where steppe empires collapsed? The answer isn't weapons, it's structure. Early Slavic societies were unusually flexible. They lacked rigid aristocracies. Leadership was temporary, situational, negotiable. In a post-Roman world where centralized authority had collapsed, this adaptability mattered more than military might. Their farming methods flourished in forested, river-rich landscapes, abandoned by imperial systems. Their settlements were small, resilient, and mobile. They didn't depend on cities that could be destroyed. But the real secret was cultural tolerance. Slavic religion didn't demand replacement. It absorbed local gods, merged rituals, accepted regional traditions. You didn't have to stop being who you were. You just had to start speaking Slavic. And that brings us to language. Early Slavic languages were astonishingly easy to learn compared to Latin or Germanic tongues. Regular verbs, logical case systems, few irregularities. In a fractured Europe filled with displaced peoples, refugees, and collapsing institutions, Slavic became the default operating system, a practical language for survival, a cultural framework that worked. So people adopted it, not because they were conquered, but because it made sense. And over generations, something subtle happened. Children grew up speaking Slavic. Old tribal names stopped being used. Former identities faded. Blood remained, names disappeared. Which raises one final question. If this story is true, if Slavic identity is largely cultural rather than genetic, why was this history buried for so long? The answer is politics. In the 19th century, nationalism demanded clean origin stories. Peoples had to be ancient, pure, and continuous. Pan-Slavism required the myth of shared blood. The Russian Empire needed Slavic unity. Later, the Soviet Union needed it even more. A story of mixed ancestry and cultural assimilation threatened everything. If Poles had Germanic roots, if Ukrainians descended from Scythians, if South Slavs were ancient Balkan peoples, then ethnic nationalism collapses, borders blur, us versus them stops working. So the simpler story won. A myth of migration, a myth of replacement, a myth of blood. But DNA doesn't lie. And now that the evidence is impossible to ignore, we can finally answer the question we started with. Who were the Slavs? They were not a single tribe. They were not a race. They were were a cultural revolution, a system that spread across Europe, absorbing Goths, Celts, Scythians, Illyrians, Thracians, Balts, Finns, and countless others, without erasing their bloodlines. To be Polish is to carry echoes of Germanic warriors. To be Ukrainian is to inherit the legacy of steppe horse lords. To be Serbian or Croat is to descend from Europe's oldest Balkan peoples. And to be Slavic is to be united not by ancestry, but by transformation. The forbidden history of Slavic origins isn't about disappearance, it's about survival through change. The greatest magic trick in European history wasn't making people vanish, it was convincing them to become something new, while keeping their ancient bloodlines alive beneath the surface. And that truth was never hidden in ruins or manuscripts, it was always written in the body, waiting for the moment science could finally read it. This is the forbidden history of Slavic genetic origins, and now that you know it, European history will never look the same again.